welcome to the Social Science Data Lab. We're excited to have Jakob Ohme here today. We'll present about the brave new data access world, what the Digital Services Act means for researcher access to digital platforms. The Social Science Data Lab is an event series here at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research, where scholars present tools and methods for the collection, analysis, and visualization of data in the social sciences. Jakob is head of the research group Digital News Dynamics at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, exploring the impact and dissemination of professional journalism on digital platforms versus other sources. He is also co-PI of the DSA40 Collaboratory that focuses on collaborative access to platform data under the EU Digital Services Act. His research interests focus on the effect of digital and mobile communication, news consumption, and political engagement, in particular across different generations. He is also dedicated to advancing digital methods, notably through the use of digital trace data. Please note, we are recording this live stream in active speaker mode. So this means the audio from on-site and remote participants will be recorded. If your video is on while asking a question later online, your video will be recorded as well. Jakob, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to talk about my Leib- and Magen topic of the last year, I would say. So I've been talking about this quite a lot, and I'm happy to also bring this to this speaker series. As always. So the goals of today, because it was a bit unclear what the level of knowledge about the DSA was, is to kind of like introduce to you what the DSA actually means. I want you to understand the background logic of Article 40. Why does this actually exist? Understand the challenges and ideally in the end know how to tackle them. And if you are thinking about going in this direction, also be able to submit your own access requests, kind of. But first, I would like you to engage a bit in this discussion and tell me very briefly, I kind of like have 3 questions, and I'm curious about your answers for those. And the first one is, what does DSA stand for? And I suggest to read carefully here. So just checking how many. Yeah, okay, we have already 8 responses, so this was easy. Apparently it is. Yeah, thank you for also doing this. Kind of like it's called the Digital Services Act, so which is something it took me a while to actually learn that. But well, great. Second question. In the context of the Digital Services Act, what does VLOP stand for? Is it a verified legal oversight procedure? Is it a verified, is it a copying mistake? Is it a very large online platform, or is it a virtual licensing and operations protocol? Also seems to be a tendency already. So, which shows if people do not only follow the first response that you actually already know quite a bit. Thank you for doing this as well. You're knowing quite a bit about the DSA. And then my question is, in case you joined this talk because you're actually interested in applying for data access via DSA40, what platforms would you like to have access to data from? And this is, of course, not the full list of platforms, but I thought it's easier to not put too many there. Okay, there's a strong interest in LinkedIn. That's good. TikTok and Instagram are probably the more expected responses. No one Zalando, no one Wikipedia. Okay. This is kind of like what we usually see, that the social media platforms have the kind of like biggest appeal for this. ChatGPT is growing right now. ChatGPT is not kind of like listed as a VLOP, but maybe being on the way there. I will explain in a second why this is. But basically right now you cannot use DSA40 to request GPT data, but this might change in the future. And Zalando I put there because it's the only German VLOP that we're actually having in Germany. All right. Starting with where we are actually coming from. So for a long time, like I'm a trained communication scholar, and I basically started research right when social media became a thing. So there was this constant question of data access and how can we actually get to social media platform data to answer all the questions that we're actually having. And I'm borrowing here from an article by Minizuka and colleagues who kind of like present this very brief history of data access and kind of like say we start at a pre-API age. So this is basically the age when the platforms or what we call platforms today were actually founded. So starting with Facebook in 2004 and the other ones following swiftly, basically meaning that there was no API access and there was also no understanding on why this would actually be necessary, right? So, I mean, Facebook started as this kind of like university project, and I think the global reach of these platforms was much lower. There was no API access. Then there was I think the arrow is golden because you could kind of like call it the golden age, where there was a voluntary API access because the platforms were growing and they kind of like included external developers and so on and so forth. They actually offered quite some decent API access. I think Facebook's Graph API, many people who have worked with think fondly about the times when this was actually possible. There was the Twitter academic API. Facebook had acquired CrowdTangle even, so that they kind of like people could use this data more. We also had the Cambridge Analytical scandal, which was also only possible because of APIs. So that's also something to think about, that there's a misuse perception of this as well. And some kind of like other projects that were actually happening there. But what platforms basically did was provide voluntary access. And this was also used for research. And I think Twitter, for example, had an academic API. So this was even kind of like specified for it, while many others, I think there was a bit of a mix between like a commercial and a academic usage. And then we were entering the rather short post API age, but yes, there was kind of like years where there was more news on closures than opening. So the CrowdTangle shutdown was actually planned, ended last year in August. Twitter ended this free API access, kind of like also ended the academic API, and now charges people $45,000 a month for kind of like having access. Reddit restricted their API access. So basically platforms rolled back, and that happened in an environment where in general, I think the idea to be regulated based on data that you give away as a platform became kind of like the main fear. So this is kind of like what happened. And then we're kind of like now in the what they call post API age. I'm not sure if I'm super on par with the term, but we moved one step closer. So, for example, there's DSA Article 40, which I will talk about in a second. There are APIs opening right now, which is also because of DSA and not because the platforms are so kind of like happy with this. But there's definitely a change coming up. So there is things growing and opening up again. And this is the age in which we are now. But the question is, how can we actually make this a successful age? Because it's also, as you can see, kind of like started 2 years ago. And if we are honest, 2023 is the correct age or a year, but actually kind of like things only got in motion in 2024 and onwards. So when we think about the ways we can actually get access to digital trace data, and with this, I mean, you can put a lot of things under this, but kind of like behavioral data, observed data from platforms. So basically a lot of things that are not self-reported. For a long time, we basically had these three options. We had the API access, which I just kind of like talked about, automated programming interfaces that were offered by the platforms, where researchers with a certain token could actually get access to the data that the platforms wanted to provide via this API. So it's not like that researchers had like a huge selection there. It's not like a candy store, but kind of like you got access to what platforms wanted you to have access to. Then there is data donations, which I think in this round is also very familiar. The possibility via GDPR Article 15.2, I think, people got access, or researchers got access to data because they asked people to donate the data that they had access to, because GDPR gave them the right to download their own data from the platforms, and then kind of like researchers were able to use them. And then there was the opportunity of tracking, which can also take very different shapes. So either people kind of like track the screens of other people, or had their own kind of like applications for this, or they just bought people from tracking panels where there was survey research coming together with kind of like client-side tracking, in the sense of that people had usually like a device on an application installed on one or more devices. And this toolbox kind of like now, I would argue, increases with two different type of access requests that we can actually have via Article 40, 12 and 44. And I will explain this in a second, but basically the opportunities come once again, like our access 4012 is very close to the API access that we actually had, but with some kind of like important changes. And then access request via 44 is pretty new and has kind of like no predecessor. So we need to really kind of like see what's actually coming out of this. But there are new kids on the block, basically, that can be used to get access to observational data. And this comes via the Digital Services Act. What is this in general? If you look into this, the aim of the DSA is to create a safer digital space where the fundamental rights of all users are protected. And the DSA includes a provision granting researchers unprecedented access to the data of very large online platforms and search engines. So this is also the lingua of the Commission, that actually describes this, first of all, as a kind of like step towards more user rights, but also then kind of like calls this unprecedented access to the data of platforms, which also means they set themselves up with this to quite high expectations that now they're working hard in the background to actually fulfill. If you look a bit closer, what is the DSA? It's kind of like a very, very long document. So it's over 300-page long EU regulation, and it regulates quite some things, as you can see. So it's not only the legally mandated data access for external scrutiny, as it's called, but there's also clearer rules for dealing with illegal content, new user rights to challenge content moderation decisions. So if your content is taken down, you now have kind of like much more power to, first of all, complain about this, but also kind of like revoke this decision. This is something the digital service coordinators are actually spending a lot of time on, because people are actually doing this to quite some extent. So for you, just too important to kind of like know, this is not only about data access, and it's actually about a lot of other things, but this is kind of like, of course, one important thing in there. We basically, there's a certain logic behind the Digital Services Act. And I think you can, and this is kind of like taken from Husovec, who kind of like distinguish this, say something in one pillar is content moderation and the other one is risk management. And the content moderation part is maybe what we would expect from it. So kind of like, I don't know, having better ways for people to understand why things are kind of like taken down, why there are challenges, but also at the same time have better flagging mechanisms for content that you as a user think shouldn't be there, and kind of like legal rights behind it for platforms to actually be much kind of like more fast and adamant to actually take it down. So this is kind of like the one thing the DSA kind of like will or has legislation that means that you have to kind of like have measures against abuse, internal appeal system, external appeal systems, and all of this. So that's the one pillar of it, in the sense of making platforms a more safe and clean, if you want to say so, environment. But we are not in this pillar, but we are actually in the risk management pillar. So there are kind of like two different activities, so to say. The one is kind of like online platform hosting services, where protection of minors, dark patterns, and know your client obligations of marketplaces is all very difficult, kind of like specific, need to be taken care of. Maybe not so interesting for us today, but also one way to actually mitigate risks. And then the other one is the very large online platforms and very large search engines who have to kind of like not apply, but anyhow, have to kind of like follow certain risk measurements. And this is much more than the data access that we actually see. For example, risk assessments and auditing of all design features of the product. This is something that platforms now have to do themselves and kind of like present this in annual risk reports to show what kind of like risks does their system pose. Does this work super well right now? No, because of course platforms tell in the first year, I think now we are in the second year where they have to kind of like submit these assessments. And in the first year, of course, they were very limited risk and everything was perfect. And then kind of like there is a community of researchers and civil society organizations pushing back and saying, no, there are these risks. They are not mentioned. You need to mention this again. So this is a very much circular process, basically. They need crisis response mechanisms, looking at the Romanian election and the TikTok case, which is, I mean, it happened at the exactly right time to kind of like showcase what this DSA is actually for, and it was in force already. So, for example, what the Commission could do is to kind of like order a freeze of all content on the platforms via the DSA so that this could be investigated further, which was something that was not possible before, which I think goes into this crisis response mechanisms. Advertising transparency, I think we've seen some of the outcomes already where Google or someone kind of like said they take down all the advertising libraries that they actually had open for a couple of years because they didn't want to comply with this, and so on and so forth. But one is, of course, the enhanced data access for researchers to study risks. And this is what we're focusing on today. What does Article 40 actually say here? Because I think it's quite helpful to look at the specific wording here. Upon a recent request from the Digital Service Coordinator, providers of very large online platforms and very large online search engines, so we should not forget the search engines, provide access to data to vetted researchers for the sole purpose of conducting research that contributes to the detection, identification, and understanding of systemic risks in the Union and to the assessment of the adequacy, efficiency, and impact of risk mitigation measures. And there is a lot of stuff in there that needs to be unwrapped, and I will do this in the coming minutes. But kind of like the first thing is the Digital Service Coordinator. So there is apparently someone who's kind of like helping with this. This is new to a lot of other initiatives where researchers had to directly deal with the platform. So there is someone coming up with a recent request to the providers of these platforms. Then it means it can only work for these very large online platforms. So you cannot ask for data access for smaller places or just any platform. Then you need to be a vetted researcher. So it also does not apply to everyone. So not every citizen can kind of like use this right, for example. Then there is the sole purpose of conducting research that contributes to detection, identification, and understanding of systemic risks. This also means we call this a purpose limitation. You cannot do all research with this. If you just kind of like wanna, I don't know, have a fun study about the most funny pet videos on TikTok, you will have a hard time to argue that there is a systemic risk component in it. I think you can understand it widely, but nevertheless, this is the point. And then the last one is mitigation measures. So it is, you can kind of like study a risk, but you can also study mitigation measures in a sense of what could actually be done against the risk. So if you think about design changes of a platform and so on, and how can you kind of like, I don't know, have a better content moderator system, or do flagging modes work the way they should, and so on and so forth. There's this idea on making the place better. And I would say there is a bit of a question on what this end actually means when you apply for it, because it could mean that you can only apply for data if you study the risks, including mitigation measures. Talking to the Commission, I don't think that this is their interpretation right now, but just kind of like say, the more mitigation thoughts you have, the easier it will probably become to get access there. And now, because it's already dense, I will say a couple of easy things about what this DSA Data Access Collaboratory actually is that Alex mentioned. It's a joint project by the European School of European New School in Frankfurt Oder and the Weizenbaum Institute. And from 1st of January, it will be only at the Weizenbaum Institute. So this will kind of like change. And we have like 4 main goals. The first one is information and networking around this topic for the scientific community, because it started with Ulrike Klinger and me kind of like realizing that the academic community is not really doing something on this topic, although it might actually be very important. That has changed over the years, right? So there have been more initiatives and so on, but I think we had the first workshop in March 2023 and had so many people actually joining, which we didn't anticipate, but there was the need for kind of like networking on this. Second, what we're doing quite a lot is consulting stakeholders. So the questions on, well, do you have suggestions for the delegated act that came out that said a lot of kind of like details for this? We were submitting this. We are also quite active in pushing misconduct or non-compliance to the Commission or the Digital Service Coordinator, because they're always looking for evidence for the cases they open against the platform. So there are a couple of cases opened already against TikTok, I think AliExpress, Meta, and X. They need evidence for this. So we are trying to providing a bit there. We have written several policy papers on this and working on applications right now. And in the end, try to kind of like evaluate also this implementation process. There's a layout structure of this. So there's kind of like a core team with especially Elka Seiling, who's doing like 90% of the work there and doing really great stuff. And we have a standing group of people from partly com science, but actually trying to get into other fields as well, because you will have to say that the social sciences are most active on this, but there are also other scientific fields who would also benefit from it. And I think there's even less kind of like knowledge about this. I think law and social sciences, they are the most active ones, but I mean, there's a lot of fields, economics, for example, and so on, who could also very benefit from this kind of data access. So we're trying to reach out, but I will say it's more difficult than, because I think the social sciences and especially communication sciences felt this pain for a long time of not having data access. And I think for a lot of other fields, this has not been the case. And then this is not hitting the kind of like right spots where here everyone's like, oh yeah, really, can this work? And there you have to be super convincing on why this actually needs to happen. Anyhow, that's the collaboratory. Now we go on with the substantial stuff. Who needs to provide data? It is the very large online platforms and search engines. They are abbreviated VLOPSs or VLOPs, depending if you take the search engines with them. And what this means is they have to have more than 45 million recipients of service per month in the European Union. And they are designated by the European Commission. So basically, the European Commission decides who is VLOP and who is not by doing their own research. There are like 2 interesting cases. The first one is all the porn platforms, which are among them, which you can see here, like Xvideo, StripChat, and so on. They all appealed in the first round by kind of like, I don't know, lowering their numbers below 45 million. And then there was kind of like a internal investigation by the Commission. And in the end, they said, no, you are definitely above this. And so now they kind of like joined this list. Probably not surprisingly, since there's always these studies that kind of like half of the internet traffic is porn in general. And then you're like, okay, how can this be that they are kind of like not big enough? But apparently they are. And now we have ChatGPT and OpenAI, which are currently under investigation. I think the last number I've heard is that they are at 42 million monthly users. And then again, recipients of service is a bit different than what a monthly user is, but it doesn't really matter. And so the expectation, also knowing the growth, is that they will kind of like become under scrutiny there as well. If you look at the distribution across Europe, you can kind of like see that there's one country that is very central, which is Ireland, where most of the very large online platforms actually sit for tax reasons. We had this issue before that Ireland was not kind of like, I don't know, very helpful for platform regulation further, like in the past, because they had very lenient laws on many things. Now, my feeling is this actually changes quite a bit, because Ireland has a digital service coordinator that takes this very seriously, and they're very well prepared. They are the biggest by far in the union. And nevertheless, they will play a core role. So whatever the Irish digital service coordinator is deciding will set basically the standards, especially because looking at this, LinkedIn is also in Ireland. So the platforms you mentioned in the survey were basically all Irish platforms. Germany has Zalando, the Netherlands have Booking.com. The porn platforms sit mostly in Eastern Europe. But in general, it is a bit kind of like many countries have one platform, but Ireland will play the main role here. So what is a digital service coordinator now? It's designated by a EU member state. So every member state had to say, okay, this is our digital service coordinator. And the countries did this very, very differently because there was no rule for it. Some kind of like founded just a new institution. Some kind of like called one person working in an institution a digital service coordinator. I know the example of Greece, where there are also not so many resources. They don't kind of like even have a department for it, but just kind of like 2 people actually working on this. And the German solution was to establish their own digital service coordinator. So it's basically an independent entity, but is very kind of like connected to the Bundesnetzagentur, which is the authority that also deals with a lot of digital services, but actually also with electricity and internet traffic in general, and so on and so forth. So they oversee online platforms and coordinate the efforts on different national regulators, researchers, and consumers. They actually have some duties, especially in the content moderation part, that are very kind of like direct in the sense of handling the complaints of citizens. This is actually something they have to do on a day-to-day basis. And then there are other things, for example, the platform access, where they play partly a direct, but only partly also an intermediate role. Why is that? Because in the end, for most of the platforms that sit in Ireland, the Irish DSC will have to kind of like formulate this reasoned request. But you have the opportunity, if you are a researcher at a German institution, to file this also with your German digital service coordinator. We basically can choose, and I'm not sure if I think this is the smartest way or not to do, but you can go via the German DSC. They will kind of like look at this, but in the end, send it to the Irish DSC. I think it makes sense because they have to kind of like understand what research institution is this person from, and so on and so forth. But in this sense, they only have a direct function if you are kind of like not Ireland in the reasoned request formulation. Unless it's Zalando, then they are kind of like in charge in Germany. But so that's a bit of a interesting setup. What's, I think, important to know is that they are actually very responsive and also want to hear from researchers. Like, I mean, I talk to them more or less all the time, but I put this email address here because I don't think it's very kind of like known. But if you have any kind of like question, you can of course always write us, but there's also like a real way to actually discuss with them, which is, I think, quite interesting because very often you don't have that with German authorities. And if you have questions, I didn't say this, just raise your hand, right? So I'm talking, but yes. So that is what the digital service coordinator is. And in a lot of ways, it will depend on their kind of like resources. And I will say that even in Germany, kind of like, I think there should have been 50 positions or something, and 17 are filled right now. So they're also not super big right now. I think Ireland is doing quite well, but it really will depend on these bodies because yeah, they decide if these things work and how long they will actually take. Okay, now Article 40 has like two kinds of data access, and that's very important to keep in mind also for the rest of the talk, but also in general. There is kind of like Article 40.12, and we also always refer to it as 40.12, which is public data access. That basically means that you can get access to data that are publicly available on platforms interfaces. And I will say for now, this is the much easier way to access data. So everything that you would have gotten from an API in the past is likely covered by this. But you can think about this, everything that is publicly visible on a platform, you could kind of like get access to. Aggregated interaction data, impression, engagement data, publicly accessible posts, you more or less name it.
Yeah. Publicly accessible mean publicly accessible without a user account, or?
Yeah, so I think this is the understanding of what the platforms give you right now. So everything that is visible when you're not logged in. So that is one problem there. But I will say that from the usage we made, a lot of stuff is actually publicly available, and especially like with X, for example, who kind of like, I don't know, waived all different kind of like security layers. So like political actors, this is all kind of like publicly available, for example. There's no political actor who kind of like sets boundaries on the visibility on their posts, so to say. So yeah, quite extensive it can be. Yes.
There may be a follow-up question on that. Isn't the X the case that you have to have an account in order to access X?
Yes, but not to access it, but not to access every content. I mean, definitely not.
Like but if it still then counts as public accessible, even if I have to do an account and then.
Yeah, but that's kind of like a different in kind of like being on the platform to have it. But you can definitely click on a link to an X post and kind of like see it publicly. So that works. Yes, so this is the public data. And then we have the non-public data access, and that's actually what's kind of like really the new thing here. And that can be many things, many more than maybe we can actually imagine, because if it is data that the platform holds, and you can argue that this is important to study a systemic risk, this goes way beyond observational data. It, of course, kind of like includes information on users, profile information, relationship networks, individual level, content exposure, and engagement histories. This point, we have worked really hard to get it actually in the delegated act so that we have this in writing, that this is also what it's meant there. But then also information to content moderation, decisions, governance, and basically even things, I mean, that's not my field, but kind of like when you come from economics or legal scholars, it can be kind of like, I don't know, the information on a board meeting or whatever. If you would want to do research with this, there is one kind of like important limitation, which is that if the platforms can argue that it violates trade secrets, this is the only reason they can appeal actually to a recent request. But then very often, I think this is not the case. They will try to do this, of course, but in many ways, the data that we would be interested in have nothing to do with kind of like violating trade secrets. There will be probably a legal decision at some point where the boundary is, but so far, this is the only way to appeal. But here, you can be really kind of like creative and imaginative in a sense of what data could this actually be. And again, in a social communication, then we kind of like know what data we want, but in other fields, this might be totally different things that you could look at. And then we have kind of like the difference in eligibility, purpose limitation, and authorization procedure for these two things. And that's why I said the one is easier than the other. So for public data, I will go into a second on what this means, but you just have to fulfill kind of like the paragraphs B to E, so which is less than A to G, apparently. In the purpose limitation, there's the detection, identification, and understanding of systemic risks, as set out in Article 34.1. This is kind of like the same for the public and the non-public data access. So systemic risk argument needs always be there. Like also for the public data access, you need to argue for systemic risk to study this. And then for 44, for the non-public data access, the mitigation measures come on top of this, but this can actually be helpful because you can also argue to kind of like study mitigation measures, which you cannot for the public data access. Authorization procedure is you submit the application directly to the provider. And that is kind of like, I think, one of the weaving mistakes of the DSA, that once again, the researchers deals with the platforms directly. And I will tell you in a bit what this actually looks like. But the platforms have forms that you need to fill in. Sometimes they are only, in the case of X, Google Forms that they are using. So it's a very simple setup, and then others have kind of like much more complicated setups. But yeah, you send it there and then you get a response. And in case of Article 44, you submit the application to the relevant DSC. As I said, this can be your DSC of national DSC or the DSC of establishment of the platform, which then in most cases is Ireland, which forwards valid requests to the provider. So there, the digital service coordinator deals with this for you. You will never talk or have any contact with the platform for this kind of like data access. And they are processed and published by the DSA data access portal, which is live now. You can find the link if you Google it, or on our FAQ website, for example. And there is kind of like an access portal that the Commission created for this purpose. So it's much more official in this sense. So what do the requirements actually mean? As you can see, for 44, you need to fulfill all of them. For 4012, you just have to kind of like show that you are independent of commercial interests, which is something that should work quite easily for researchers, not so much for journalists, by the way. So I think for them, this will not work probably because they have most of the time some commercial interest, which is sad and something we tried to change, but no one listened. Disclosure of research funding, also something we are used to demonstrate the capability of fulfill request-specific data security and confidentiality measures, description of appropriate technical and organizational measures. This is kind of like one thing that the platforms take very serious because there they can find loopholes or ways to kind of like reject people. If you're planning on this, the best thing is to go to your IT department and exactly kind of like ask, I need a statement of this. And then they will give you like 2 pages on how they secure their servers and blah, blah, blah. And that is usually enough, but it's not enough to kind of like write, I will store the data on a secure server. Then platforms will immediately reject it. So you need to demonstrate capability is a different thing than I will do something. But this is handleable, and I think every IT department can actually do this. I will say that for our colleagues in the civic society organizations, this is a much bigger issue because they don't have the IT department behind them, right? So, and they also don't have someone authoritative enough to really kind of like prove this. So that's something where they actually fiddle a lot with. But for researchers, this should actually work. And then you have to kind of like show the data access and timeframes requested are necessary for and proportionate to the research purposes. So you basically say, there's a systemic risk. I want to study this. I need this data to study this. And this needs to kind of like align, right? So if you kind of like say, I want to study a nitty-gritty thing, but I want to kind of like have historical data access back to 2016, that will not work. Like this needs to align. But I think also nothing that we are unable to do also from the way we work usually. And then if you kind of like see what comes on top for 44 is basically to say you need to have an affiliation with a research organizations. And this means you need to kind of like show a legal affiliation. it is an open, like a work contract will definitely work. It's an open question if affiliation letters or some kind of like affiliated researchers agreement and so on, if this will count as well. Something we are looking into if you want to work, for example, with a civic society organization, because for them, they would have a hard time to really argue that they're a research organization based on the definition of the commission on what a research organization is, right? So there is, of course, law there. Then you need to show that the data is used solely for performing, and the solely is kind of like important here, the systemic risk part. And that's also important, results must be made publicly available free of charge, which basically means not only that you have to publish open access, but if you apply for this, you really need to conduct the research and also kind of like get something out of it. So this kind of like, I just gather data and then I have it lying around and then, I don't know, just my PhD student stops and then no one will actually touch this anymore, is not an option here. And I think also it's very crucial that we don't even try to get away with it, because this will kind of like very much counter the intention that the commission had, because that is maybe for a different talk. But the idea behind this is that your information actually goes into a bigger risk assessment or risk governance framework that the commission has set up, based on which they want to kind of like work on platform regulations. So they're not doing this for us and for our publications. They're doing this because they want to know what the risks actually are, and they need the evidence, which is very smart to understand this, that you first need evidence before you actually regulate something. So they will look, and you need to register this also in the data access portal. They will look closely for the outcomes of this because they want to know what's the basis. They don't tell you what to research. So I think the freedom of research is not kind of like restricted, but they restrict it in a sense by saying, we only also invest into this, right? So there are people working and so on, because we want to know about a systemic risk and the mitigation measures. Then let's jump to what does systemic risk actually means. This is one of the fun things that this has been written into it. No one has, I think, really thought about this super carefully. Like all my legal friend scholars kind of like say, yeah, super fluffy and kind of like not a very good way on actually defining this. But you can kind of like take what's in there as a very good guideline on what you can actually definitely study with this. So dissemination of illegal content, negative effects on the exercise of fundamental rights. And fundamental rights means a lot of things: human dignity, private and family, protection of personal data, freedom of expression, information, non-discrimination, rights of a child, high-level consumer, to a high level of consumer protection. Negative effects on civic discourse and electoral processes, something we are kind of like probably all very interested in, or public security. And also negative effects in relation to gender-based violence, protection of public health and minors, serious negative consequences to the person's physical and mental well-being. This is for the field of communication science. I think this covers like, I think 80% of what people are actually doing on platform research. So I don't think in my field we will have like super big issues in arguing for this. But again, this is kind of like, it says include the following systemic risk, but this is not kind of like a concluding list. So if you can think about anything else and you can argue for it, there's also more possible, basically. One interesting question is how high or low level the application arguments actually need to be. So I can come up with a very intellectual argument on why platforms in general are a problem for a democratic functioning of a democratic system and so on and so forth. But do I kind of like write 10 pages to kind of like outline my argument, and will this actually be enough? Or do I need to be more specific and kind of like say, I think, I don't know, misinformation is a problem because this spreads? But that's kind of like a very different level of argument. And no one will give you an answer. The commission always has broad understanding of systemic risk, but this is an empirical question, and we will only know in the future about what this actually will be. And then we have risk mitigation, which is Article 35, where you actually have even a more complete list, so to say. It's not complete, but kind of like a more extensive list by saying, okay, adapting design features, reinforcing internal processes, cooperation with trusted flaggers, implementing decisions out of court dispute settlement bodies, and so on and so forth. Like a lot of things that you could think about what a mitigation measure actually can be. Ours would probably be more on the content moderation, algorithmic setup side, and so on and so forth. But you can come up with very different ways on what you think is actually helpful. I would also be very curious, since I'm not a big proponent of these social media bans that they come up with for minors right now in many different countries. But if you would kind of like do a study and kind of like say that age protection as kind of like a mitigation strategy, which apparently it is what people understand it is to be, and you test this would kind of like also be, for example, a mitigation measure, and so on and so forth. So these are the two things that basically you can do or not do, and again, understand it in a wide understanding. So you can come up with something else, but I think this also covers quite a couple of things already. Yes. And then how does the authorization procedure actually works for 4012? It's actually not so complicated. You have a data access application. You kind of like send this or the researcher, principal investigator, or wherever formulates this and submits it to the platforms. Then they do a completeness check. That's the first thing. So, for example, if you don't have kind of like this statement of technical operational measures and so on, you probably get it back immediately. That sometimes goes quicker. And then they will kind of like make a decision if the application is complete. If not, you get it back. If it's complete, they will make a decision on the request, and you will kind of like receive data access as specified in the access application. So what you need, and with this, you will get usually access credentials to an API that you then can use. And if this is kind of like declined, then you will receive reasons why the application was declined. This is kind of like the way how it works. And this is, of course, the ideal scenario. It's complete. They kind of like grant you the access, and then you get the credentials. I will say when you have the credentials, you are rather free in what you query actually from the API. Like there's no, I also don't know if this technically would work. Legally, you're of course kind of like bound to do what you actually have kind of like proposed in this application, but I haven't seen any case where researchers have done other things and also kind of like used it to study other purposes or risks. But nevertheless, the only thing is they always come right now with a strong rate limit. So if you need more, like you really have to think about the amount of data that you actually need and ideally apply for higher rate limits. But I've also seen that people do, and then they just get kind of like the smaller one. This is a constant issue that we are having. I just had a nice conversation with TikTok on this a week ago, because we are having requested increase of rate limit, which we also specified in the original application already. And they constantly say no for no reason, of course, but it's illegal. There's no kind of like legislation stating that you can kind of like decrease this or kind of like keep this to a certain limit. But yeah, so that's basically how it is, how it looks for you. Basically, you go to this page, fill this in, kind of like wait until you hear something back. If you're lucky, you get through. If you're not lucky, you kind of like get into something that will take a bit longer. And I talk about this in a second. This is kind of like how it looks for YouTube. This is how it looks for TikTok. On our FAQ on the website, we have a complete list of all these forms, because they're a bit hard to find. You don't go to X and then there is kind of like on the first page something for researchers and you just kind of like click through. They're basically very hidden somewhere in some kind of like terms of services and so on. But there is a complete list on our website, and if you need this, you can find it there. We also checked a bit what the platforms actually ask from researchers, I think. No. And there is kind of like an issue going on, and I hope this will change a bit, because right now platforms over ask information. They are actually only allowed to ask these 5 things that I showed you. So basically, what's the purpose of the research? What data do you need? Do you do the technical operational measures? Can you show that your funding is independent of commercial interests? That is what they are supposed to ask you. And of course, what they do is to kind of like ask much more, as you can see here. So kind of like who you want to collaborate with, which access modality, data security, your qualifications, some technical things, some legal things, previous experience, and so on and so forth. They're all not supposed to ask most of these things. The Commission is aware of this, and I think there will be a ruling at some point that they have to kind of like minimize their forms. But I will say right now, many of the platforms make the fields mandatory, so you have to put something there. And it's a bit like if you apply for US immigration, you can probably just put none there and see whether this actually helps. But I have the feeling that it will not help your case if you do not specify this. They also don't ask the most crazy information, but it's more like a thing of you should not, so why do you, right? But yeah, I would say this is something together. If you have thought about your research project, you have gathered this in kind of like 1 or 2 days. Like it's not a major thing to actually get this together. And then what we experience a lot is that platforms, of course, push back. So first of all, it takes quite a while. So there are delaying tactics by platforms. By just kind of like, I don't know, taking 40 days. There's the ruling in due time. They have to provide this. But what due time is some kind of like one of these legal terms that needs to be defined. They have an overly restrictive reading of Article 4012 in the sense of that they ask you to show that your data is solely be usable for studying this one thing, which is of course not possible. It's like, I don't know, asking for eggs, flour, and milk, and then promising that there's only this one cake you can bake out of it, which is of course not true. You can always bake other cakes. So that is, I think, illegal. The data access formats very broadly. Location of researchers is a thing. The ruling is quite clear that you have to study systemic risk within the European Union, which does not mean you have to be from the European Union. This is also true for the 44 data access. But of course, they use this, and they also have rejected people because they have not been affiliated with a research institution, which is not what you need to be. Like CSO, civil society organizations can request data, although they are not kind of like part of a research institution. We have kind of like experiences on all of this. What I would just say, be ready to push back. It's also kind of like actually fun to engage with this a bit, because mostly in the end it will work. And if you experience any problems there, we are happy to help. Elka has many experiences with this and what's the right wording and so on and so forth. But what happens is that they keep you in this kind of like, please provide more information. You provide more information, then much more time goes by, and then they will ask for more and so on. So that's something we have quite strong evidence for, but of course this has also been pushed forward to the Commission. We have this data access tracker, which is where I have this results for. So we use it to kind of like get an empirical basis and say, okay, how well this works or not. If you apply for it, please register there, because it will help you, because we have a couple of points that we already highlight, but it will also help the community, so to say, to hear what problems you actually kind of like encounter. All right. And then any questions on the public data access? Yes.
I was just wondering, in terms of like data quality, like if I have to use go through this whole process of acquiring it, and then they also push back, I probably have to go to court and months of it. Like, what does the resulting data set look like? Do you get like like meaningful quality data in terms of like accuracy or like or either completeness, or is it the platform also purposefully take out some data to make sure that you can only bake like one specific cake, or not not I don't know, meaningful results that you want to answer?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I think there are issues with data quality, and the problem is that there is no gold standard for it, right? So we don't have an independent source. That's the same with data donations. We cannot be sure that the data donations are correct and that no one has fiddled with this in the back. You get API access. So this basically means you are free to query whatever you want. Not in a sense of that you should not query what you actually, you should query what you actually apply for, but there is no kind of like restriction that you can only have these 5 keywords in the query. So I think there is kind of like a broad pool of data that you will actually access, which makes me think that there's probably some meddling with the general pool, but I don't think it really meddles with your specific research question. This would be high engineering to actually do this, and I don't think this is happening right now. But what we've seen, but also with data donations, is that actually public scraping data did not match with the API data. There is a piece on TikTok where there were just differences and stark differences, right? I'm not talking about 250 versus 251, but right, really differences in the thousands. TikTok has been confronted with this and also responded to it, saying that there were technical issues. This might always happen and might always be a reasoning. So I think saying that there's something intentionally wrong is very difficult. But of course, if you can, it always makes sense to double check, maybe with some kind of like pilot scraping to just see for 1 or 2 days if your data actually add up. The scraping part is in most legal reading covered by the DSA as well. So you have a right to scrape through the DSA, which solves a lot of issues and questions that people have had before with this. But in general, it's the best data you get. But if it's 100% quality, that is impossible to say. But given that the alternative is also not better, it's kind of like, someone would need to go to the platforms and do kind of like heavy audits, and that needs to be kind of like coming through regulators. I don't see this happening right now, but this is what you would need for it in total.
Do you have time to ask one question? I was just wondering about how the platforms also change how people can reach these like forums to ask for the data. Do they regularly change, like for instance, where the form is located within the platform?
The URLs don't change too much. I think that's why I hope, I mean, if you encounter that one of the links at our FAQ doesn't work anymore, but I haven't seen this too much. Like, I think this is rather stable. It would also be a way to kind of like complicate things if they would do this, but I don't think they do.
And do these like platform providers also try to argue what is considered public data?
Yes, but there's a very nice report from the Knight Georgetown initiative on what is public data. I think we also featured this on the website, but I can also send it to you afterwards. If you send me an email and ask for it, then I will send you a link. Yes, there is a question on what this is, and there is also some initiatives kind of like trying to get this to a max, because what platforms, they give you API access right now. But for example, if you're interested in what were the most 10 viewed posts in an election campaign or whatever, where you can clearly argue that there is a systemic risk question behind this, you actually don't get this. You need to kind of like scrape all the election content, however you do, or kind of like query this election content, and then you need to find the most viewed one. But of course, the viewing of a post that is popular is kind of like part of public data, right? So you could argue that platforms also need to provide other means of data access if you ask for this. Right now, they don't do this. We also filed a request to I don't know, 5 platforms with exactly this trial, and it was a trial, and we basically with Mozilla Foundation and Algorithm Watch, and we knew it would fail, and it failed. But this is something then to kind of like go back to the commission and say, here, what is actually the understanding of what public data is? But I think we can always look for the odd one out, but I think for 90% of the things, it will actually work. If people have worked with APIs before, they will be rather happy with this type of access as well. But yeah, chances are that platforms will challenge most of the things that are in there, but it also works to a good extent. Like, yeah. Yes.
Maybe one quick follow-up on that is in terms of, I was wondering in terms of scale, because you just alluded to that we could potentially just scrape all, I don't know, put news posts related to a certain election. So this would be potentially possible in a way that you could also like across European states, and like you potentially have, like with the, let's say, old Twitter API, you potentially have access to quite a lot, giving just the limit restrictions.
Exactly. Okay. So the point is the limit to the rate limits. And we did this for the Bundestagswahl, and we didn't get an increase on the rate limit there. And this was on X, and X is, you can talk to TikTok. This actually works. There are some channels, but X is just kind of like stonewalling you. So we couldn't kind of like increase this, which meant we basically, based on our calculation, got roughly half of the content around the German election on X, which is
all posts in Germany in that direction.
Based on what we created with kind of like keywords and hashtags and so on and so forth, and party accounts and so on. Yeah, but it's also only half, right? I mean, better than nothing.
Yes, like absolutely, but
yeah. And you can, of course, go retrospectively as well. But yeah, this should work. I think this big European approach, I would rather, if you really want to go for it, I would rather say find colleagues in each country and file 27 different access requests and do it per country. But theoretically, yes. And that's also something that Rebecca Tromble, who's kind of like a front runner and probably the most knowledgeable person in this field, always says, theoretically, if you want to know how much misinformation is an issue in a European election campaign, what you would on digital platforms, you would need kind of like access to all political posts in that time to determine if we are talking about 1% or 0.1% or something like this. But yeah, I don't know any super large request on a like all European level that has been filed, but theoretically, yes. If they would not be so stupid with the rate limits. Okay, then I quickly, because I'm actually talking for a long time already, sorry, I thought I'm already done now, but authorization procedure for non-public data access. This is all quite new. This only came into effect 29th of October 2025. So there's not much experience with this, but theoretically, there's an access application, as always, which you file via this data access portal. You can see the points here for each applicant. You need to kind of like, I don't know, do what you would expect basically, commitment to make in public and so on and so forth. Information about funding, description of the data, necessity and proportionality of data and timeframes, identified risks and technical, legal, operational measures, description of research activity, summary. This doesn't sound much, but it will mean that if you go through it, the level of detail, someone said, will probably look a bit like a ERC application. Like you need to have a real research proposal and you have to have given it real thought on what data you actually want. Also the proportionality of the data. So do you actually get too little or too much? You will need good arguments because this is the highly sensitive data or can be highly sensitive data. So this is nothing you write in 1 or 2 days, but this is something you really need to kind of like consider this as a bigger research project, depending on what you want. You could also ask for like one nitty-gritty tiny thing, and then maybe it would be quicker. But I think also in the interest of not overloading DSCs with something very specific, I think this is understood as the big bazooka, as our former chancellor would kind of like say, of requests. Then you submit this via the data access portal. And then either the DSC of member state or DSC of establishment, again, you can send it to Ireland or Germany. It will, in the end, not matter too much, I think. Will give out a reasoned request, which gives a start and an end date of data provision. Access modalities, super important and right now heavily discussed, because how does a platform give you access to very high sensitive data? That can only be secure processing environments. Right now, we don't have many institutions who actually provide them. GESIS is working on something like this, but also doesn't have it ready yet. And then the platforms probably will provide their own secure processing environments, for which we don't. First of all, we don't know what this will actually mean for data quality and so on. But we also, for example, don't know if they will not get to the idea to charge for this, because this is all costly on the back end. You can kind of like understand this. But the DSC will decide the access modality. You, as the applicant, can definitely suggest access modalities. And maybe if you do not ask for any kind of like highly personal sensitive data, you can also just come up with some kind of like easier data transfer option. But the DSC will decide, and a summary of the access application. Then there are two things that platforms can do. They can ask for an amendment by saying we don't have the data. But if they do this, they need to give an alternative that should ideally be able to answer your research question as well. And then if this really all shit hits the fan, then kind of like they can go into a mediation process, which takes longer to settle dispute. But the point is they cannot say no. So once the reasoned request has been formulated or issued by the DSC, you will get some data. The question is this the data you want? And the question is, how does the process on the way look like? But in general, you would get data access, then you do your research activity, then there will be a termination of the data access, which is important, and which is, I know Katrin Weller from GESIS is actually working on the question, how do we actually kind of like archive the data and make it potentially replicable? Is that even possible? My answer right now is, well, probably it's going to be very difficult, but whatever. And in the end, you need to open access publish your results. This is kind of like the process that we are looking there right now. And in total, there are like time frames given by the legislator to the digital service coordinators and how long each of these steps can take. In total, this whole thing cannot take more than 9 months. So, and this is with all the, they will, if they use all the time adding up, and probably they will in the beginning, this is kind of like the time frame we are looking at.
Sorry, to data access, 9 months.
To data access, yeah. Yeah, sorry, not to the publication, yeah, but to data access, sorry. So this process will take can take up to 9 months. But if there's no amendment request and no mediation, then, for example, it will be also faster. But yeah, that's what I mean. It's like a project application. It's not a quick fix for something. But this will then also mean you have like access to pretty important data.
Yeah. From data access to the end, are there any?
No, I think you specified this, and I think it's feasible to say that you need data access for 3 years if you're studying up to an election campaign or something like this, depending on, again, the argument and the research question. But no, there is no specification there. Okay. Yeah, now this is bigger, which was smart because you couldn't read it, but there it is. And yeah, then maybe just kind of like ending this with who enforces data access, because who is actually responsible for what? In the end, it's the European Commission. Like if all of this doesn't work, then it's the European Commission who has quite some strong tools in the DSA to kind of like force platforms for compliance. This goes for this usual kind of like, I don't know, 4% of the annual revenue and so on. So it can be very expensive. And in the end, but this is not only for data access, but also for general non-compliance to the DSA, there's also the possibility to ban platforms from the European market if they do not comply. So there is kind of like a sharp sword. Given the geopolitical situations we are in, it's very unlikely that this will be quickly used. But basically, if platforms do not comply with any of this, they would face kind of like this as the last consequence, which, believing people who know more about this than me, is always like platforms cannot miss out on the European market. And of course, I would also not advise the Commission to actually do this, because then people would be on the streets, I guess, if all the social media would be gone from one day to another. But nevertheless, the digital service coordinators are actually independent authorities. And so what they are mainly doing is coordinating with national authorities, for example, data protection agencies and so on and so forth, or the, oh God, what is it called in German? The Landesmedienanstalten, who are actually responsible for the Jugendschutz, like minor protection in media and so on and so forth. So they do a couple of this. And then they do the researcher vetting under Article 44, like the non-public ones, if this is submitted to them, something they're doing as well. And then we also have a European Board of Digital Services, where actually the digital service coordinators meet with the Commission, and kind of like this is a very active gremium where they come up with solutions and kind of like see how things are going and so on and so forth. But there is kind of like a force behind this, so to say. Okay. I have like a couple of final points, but I can probably skip them and just kind of like say, okay, what do you need to prepare? What you need to do, you need to prepare. If you kind of like want to submit this, a good thing is to take some time to sit down and really think this through. I think it's not like a very quick fix. Again, 4012, you can probably do in 1 or 2 days if you think carefully about this. For 44, I think what's very important to consider is also, do you have the funding for this? So basically, I'm very hesitant right now to actually file something myself, because I would rather know that I have the funding for X years and the people power to actually do this. Because if I go big and kind of like, I don't know, want to do this all European something data, someone needs to deal with this. And we are not very well equipped in this, right? So we don't know what data we will actually get. We don't know how to classify this, how difficult this will actually be, and so on and so forth. So I think for me, this is kind of like running parallel to large-scale research project applications. We have a bit of a catch-22 there, because right now there's not a lot of experience with this. If you kind of like apply to a funder by saying you want to use this data source, they will not be very happy, because this is very hypothetical, right? And no one really knows if you will actually get the data. But you should also not really apply for the data if you don't have the funding for it. I think the ERC funding, they are thinking about this. We talked to DFG and they have not really considered this to be an issue. So we don't know how it goes, and it will probably very much depend on the individual handling. But ideally, of course, we would have something like a specific track for this type of application, where you have a high uncertainty and where you could also say you only get the funding if you get the data access, right? Because otherwise this will not work anyhow. But yeah, you know, things are moving slowly in practice, but also in the head of people. Yes. Familiarize yourself with the data access portal. You can log in, you can click through without actually filling anything in. So that's nice that you already can get to the end and know what you actually have to do. And if you kind of like have any questions, you can reach out to me or our email address in general. And we are happy to kind of like help and prepare. What is next in this? I think we expect summer 26 to have the first experience with data access requests under this non-public scheme. There are these cases opened against several VLOPs, and some of them, like AliExpress, not so interesting for us, but has already been decided. There was also a first ruling that the 4012 access forms do not comply with the legislation. Now the platforms kind of like have time to actually respond to this. So this will take, again, a while, but stuff is actually moving there. If you're interested in the topic, we have a newsletter where we kind of like, talk about the newest things that actually happen. We have this FAQ that are on the website that I really recommend you. And I would ask you to also spread the word a bit, because I think this can only work if we reach a critical mass of people doing this. First of all the effort that is going into this needs to be kind of like, I don't know, there need to be a payback at some point that it actually works. But so far, the field is not super informed about this, which is why I'm thankful that I can be here and talk to you about this, but also kind of like, I don't know, be a bit of an ambassador for this and just kind of like tell people, hey, I've heard about this new thing. And so that it kind of like spreads a bit further. I think this would help us and would probably help the commission to some extent as well. And if this was all too much too quickly, which it probably was, then we have like a really recent paper where we discuss basically all of what I said in greater detail and with nicer, bit more complicated forms and all of it. But that should probably cover most of the questions as well. And I think this was it. Thank you.
Yeah, great. It's a bit overview of DSA40 and also walking through potential application of these two different options. No time for questions. If you're online, you can unmute yourself and just ask or post your question in the chat.
Is there anyone? So far, I think, thanks for the presentation. We know that, and this kind of getting the data is free kind of stakeholders, right? The regulators like the European Commissions and the DSA, right? And DSC researchers want to get the data and the platform that provide the data, right? I think throughout the talk, I learned a lot so much about the kind of difficulties or between researchers and how to deal with the DSCs. But what are the concerns from the platforms apart from, I don't know, the data is being used in a misused in certain ways? And in your opinion, how can researchers kind of mitigate that? Kind of like, I don't want to use the word pamper, but like kind of understand the concerns of the platform to make the whole data access process easier.
Good question. To be honest, I think we are in very difficult times to pamper or kind of like attenuate concerns on that side there. Something that I learned from kind of like talking to platforms is because they are American, most of them, they have a very different understanding of privacy. So we think of privacy a lot in the sense of data protection, so to say, right? But their real concern, or one of their real concerns, which is why, for example, Meta, where it's kind of like a content library where you can access, get DSA 4012 access, is that the single user probably did not very consciously decide on their public settings of information. So they kind of like really say, well, but what, and they think mostly from the American user point, right? What if, I don't know, Grandma Betty kind of like now becomes part of your European DSA crawling, basically, but what is her right to privacy there? And we would then say, well, if her content is public, it can kind of like produce outcomes. Very unlikely that the baking recipe of apple pie is kind of like doing this, but nevertheless, there are two very different things, confronting, so to say. I would say, well, everything that's public can be kind of like creating harm, and that's why we need access to study this. And they would say, yeah, but what about her right to privacy in the sense of that she maybe didn't understand the settings of the post? And that basically points to the fact that platforms also don't really believe that their privacy functions are working for everyone. But I think this is something that I learned, that probably, to answer your question, taking this seriously and kind of like not only maybe sending the technical operational measures, but really kind of like make sure that, I don't know, anonymization is a core thing, and that kind of like data that is not necessarily will be immediately deleted and blah, 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 blah. Like these things are maybe a potential way to kind of like attenuate the tensions that you might have with the platforms on this. That is the only thing I can come up with. Right now, they don't want regulation. And my argument, where I'm always saying we are all working for the same thing, I don't want platforms to be gone. I just don't want them to kind of like present any kind of like major risk to me, my friends, my family, or my society. That is not an argument that works. Like, I mean, unfortunately, we're on very different sides there. They kind of like see this much more also through Trump and the administration as a censorship tool. This is also how the DSA is talked about in the US right now specifically. And there's very little you can do on an individual level to kind of like, I don't know, make a good argument for why it's actually not. So I think this is also why it's important that we have this, because that's a legislation. And we have to kind of like push this through, because the time of argumentation did not work, right? There was like social science 1 initiatives and so on, where there was collaboration with platforms, and in the end, this never came to a good ending. So yeah, that's the unfortunate answer maybe to this.
Yes.
Also saying from my side, it's really interesting to see that, like, what is potentially out there also in terms of bigger projects. I was wondering in terms of the DSA 12 access and how this is different from data you would usually, or like where the data donation data you would usually get, where is that kind of located? Because it seems like it is more actually what you would get with the non-public data in the end.
Yeah.
So this is something that you could, like, if you think about that, whether, like, this is my first question, whether this is more in that line. And I have a second question, which is basically on the role of the digital service coordinators. They seem like quite good contact persons to actually get in contact with the correct representatives in the companies. And I was wondering whether you would think that these people are potentially also people that you could contact if you, for example, see that there's obviously data missing, for example, in GDPs or in other sources. I'm thinking of, I don't know, YouTube doesn't provide data on likes, how often you like stuff, which is obviously missing, but it's obviously there because you can get that data, whether they would be contact persons.
Yeah.
Because my issue is that, for example, in that case, I contacted Google a couple of times, but eventually after 3 or 4 mails, they just ended the conversation.
Yeah, I think it helps to talk to platforms if you have some weight in this kind of like debate. But as a single researcher, I think this is not time well spent. So, I mean, first, answering this reversely, basically. Yes, if you experience any kind of like problems, I think it makes totally sense to kind of like push this on to the DSCs, because they collect these cases and will also forward them to the commission. The issue is they will not solve your individual issue. That is kind of like where you always have to think altruistically, in the sense of this will help, and in 2 years, my piece of evidence will actually be used to kind of like get to a different ruling. They will not kind of like on your behalf contact Google and kind of like fix this issue. That is a bit of the unfortunate answer. You can ask for it, but I don't think they will, because that's also kind of like meddling with the legal procedure, so to say, right? And if data is missing, then this is also an issue not only for you, but for more people, and then they will also try to solve it like this. So data donations are not part of DSA, so this is kind of like a GDPR legislative tool, but not like a DSA tool. But yes, in general, you could get to the same data via DSA4 request, plus, of course, asking more for it, because that's kind of like the interesting part, that, of course, data donations are restricted to the data that platforms actually hold about the individual user. But you could, for example, we always talk about how reverse or prospective this needs to be. But theoretically, you could argue I need to see the full screen or the full feed of whatever 1,000 people randomly drawn, however you do this in an access request. So the devil is always in the detail. For Instagram, something that you don't get, we just discussed the data right now, right? But with the argument for systemic risk, you could actually ask for it. The issue is we don't know, and there's a very other good paper, I should have put this in there, by Jeff Allen and the Integrity Institute, that discusses how platforms actually save content. That is very important to know, and this is why I also think this kind of like arguing for data that you actually want will be difficult. Like the one example is that he said, well, if you just ask for age and they don't have the age specifically, but maybe they just store you in age brackets, that could be that, because this is how their storage actually works. They don't really care about your personal age, right? And if you gave a wrong number or whatever, or they didn't have a field when you sign up, they maybe have not stored this. The question is not what did you put in, but what do they store? And so there might be many ways of how you can actually get to data donation-like data, but you can probably extend this quite a bit, depending on whether platforms still have the data. And I think this will be a core hustle in arguing on what is actually stored or not. Like Jeff Allen, he worked at Facebook for a long time. So he told me, for example, that, I don't know, the amount of pretests run on a single day during the election campaign, not pretests, A/B tests, sorry, like is in the 10,000s globally. But how long do they actually store the data on the pretest? Because usually, A/B tests. So because usually they kind of like make a decision on them, and then a feature is changed, and then the platform moves on. Like they don't keep a track of their, because 10,000 a day, that gets to kind of like billions over years. So it's not like, it's very unlikely that you could request all A/B testing happening around elections in all countries for the last 10 years, because platforms probably don't have this data anymore. And I think this is the same with the exposure storage data. We don't know if they actually keep them, and since they are not in the data donation packages, unlikely that they have some type of storage of an individual exposure feed. So what you would need to do is to kind of like get a recent request that says you need to store this for this amount of people for this amount of time for my research project. And then you would get kind of like very different types of data, but you need to do it prospectively, which means long time. But if you have this data, then it's of course unprecedented and what you basically need and want. And theoretically, you can ask this for all German users around the election campaign or so on. I would always be careful to go for this kind of like, also in the sense of who should provide and handle this data in the end. That's kind of like also something you need to show, but yeah.
One more question by Frederick, who's online.
Yeah, hi. Like going into more detail on what you've just talked about. I mean, would you say that given that the current legislation or ideas by the European Commission with the GDPR omnibus and the potential danger for like data donations, which I know that you're also concerned about, right? Like, can the DSA40 thing be used? Like, can it really be a replacement in more detail for like the potential loss we get if we can't do data donations anymore? And alternatively, if we can keep doing data donations, like, can you actually combine these two data? I mean, also maybe from a legal perspective and from a technical perspective. So, I mean, this, as you said, we need to know more about what these companies actually store, right? But I mean, would that be also legally maybe possible?
I mean, first of all, yes, we need to keep data donations. We need to kind of like work towards this, and this kind of like recent change that has been suggested to the GDPR and the omnibus amendments, endangers this, and we're working. There's an open letter that I think some of you maybe have seen. Otherwise, it's on our website or on LinkedIn to sign it. We need to work towards this kind of like being still open, because what I think is the key is that we have kind of like data access and we use it in different ways for triangulation. You need basically scraping, you need data donations, and you need DSA. So then you can always check against some kind of like other standard, and all of them has something to do with platforms. So that is kind of like, you will never get to the objective data. They are not falling from the sky, and we can also not do this. But I think my idea is not to kind of like say, we don't need data donations anymore because we have the DSA44 specifically, because as I said, a data donation project you can kind of like do with a bit of funding and a bit of kind of like people who can do this. I don't think you should do a DSA44 project if you don't have kind of like bigger parts of funding for it. So it's scope-wise, but also, and I also like still the data donation idea that you actually kind of like get the consent of the citizens, which is actually something that you will not have in many 44 requests, which is a valid point. And I would also suggest, for example, that it might be possible to kind of like get to a survey sample, kind of like asking them specifically if you are allowed to kind of like, or telling them that you want to kind of like request data on their behalf via this and this. And if you get the consent of the people and then have the user IDs, you would go directly to the platforms and say, I need for these 1,000 people the user IDs, because with this and this, I can study a systemic risk that is necessary. That would be my ideal way, rather than asking for millions of kind of like private or personal identifiable information without having asked the people. And I will say, I'm still waiting for the moment when some political party, hopefully no one's listening, kind of like comes up with the idea of blowing this up, that now the EU can actually get access to your very private data, which is kind of like true, because that's what DSA 44 does. This is why people call this kind of like non-public data and not private data, although it is very often, it is also private data that you get access to. So that was the first question. And the second question was
whether, I mean, it's legally possible to combine data donation data with...
Yes, it is. But you will need to specify this also in the application. So we had these talks with some of the legislators. If you try to combine data with other data, first of all, this is also something your ethical review board will be very interested in. So, I mean, this is also something to care about. But yes, it is legally possible, but you need to specify it in the application procedure. And I think for transparency reasons, this is also a fair thing and request to actually have and do.
I see. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Jakob. Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Yeah, crazy, right?
For a great talk and for being here. This was the last event in the Social Science Data Lab in this semester. We'll be back in the spring with a new series of talks. So thanks for joining, thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for having me.